Welcome to the second part in our series Life and Society in Transformation, here from the Goetheanum in Dornach. We try and offer contributions to the dramatic time we live in, crises that keep society in suspense, social crisis, crisis of the financial markets, the ecological crisis, the climate crisis, and the current crisis of the pandemic. What these crises have in common is that we have developed a particular relationship with the world. To put it briefly, we know the price of everything, but we no longer know the value of anything. Our relationship with the world is one where we count, measure, weigh the world, where we dissect everything and weigh it to see what we can do with it. But before we have understood it, we have already torn it from its context and only understand what we can count, measure or weigh, ultimately what is dead, what is physical, chemical, electrical, but not what is really alive, what constitutes the context, not the soul aspect, the human spirit, the actual essence. In other words, that we cannot grasp with these methods. In this series, we want to find a way of cautiously approaching what is alive, what is living. Humanity is looking back on a long journey. As we said in the first series, we started in a unity, connected with the whole, with everything. Everything was as yet unseparated. The Bible refers to the state as paradise, and we have left this paradise, descending increasingly from this divine sphere, from this unity into matter, into the understanding of the earth. Research, science, technology, how can we understand these objects, this world that we encounter, a consciousness of objects, a dual consciousness, I am here and the world is over there, and we realize that with this relationship that we have built up with the earth and life, but also with ourselves and our fellow humans, that again we ultimately produce death and destruction if we don't learn to understand how everything that lives is connected. That is, if we do not re-establish the connection back to this unity. But I have to draw it like this because of the two-dimensional blackboard. But going back is never going back to the original beginning, but at a different level. That means, is connectedness, community possible in a new way, on a level where we can take the freedom along that we have gained on this journey? That is the greater journey of humanity that we are on now. And on this journey, we have subdued the earth. We are exploiting it. We dominate it. We conquer it. We have conquered entire continents. We know how to build water dams to retain the water, how we can use it as drinking water or in sewers. We can use everything, but we have fallen out of this wider, greater, unique wholeness. And at the Goetheanum, a name that refers to Goethe, we are concerned with the science of life, of the living, a science that re-establishes the connection. In other words, a science that does not describe the world from outside as something we are outside of, but that connects, where I try to enter into what I want to describe and understand, and then develop appropriate ways out of this connectedness of how to deal with the world, with life, with plants and animals, but also with myself and my fellow humans. And today we want to speak about water, focusing on the question, what forms does life require? And if we look at the state of water on Earth, that is simply horrible. We have locked it up in canals, we poison it, we exploit it. We are causing the earth to be increasingly dry. The question of where to find water might well provoke and determine the wars of the future decades. We are in the process of gradually ruining this planet, and the role of water is a central one in this. Water is indeed much more than H2O. Water is a very special substance. It is something that underlies everything that lives. There is no life without water. And water makes up 71% of the surface of this planet. But water is not only what we see in the lakes, rivers, oceans, but water is in an everlasting cycle. It rises, warmed up by the sun, spreads out in the air, and falls down again in other places. A constant cycle across the earth of rising and descending water that passes through different states of matter. 34 times per year, approximately, does the water go through this cycle. Every place on earth is connected in its own way with water. By the way, water is different in every place. It is different, say, in a dark, shadowy forest brook, for example, from a brook that runs through a meadow. It flows faster. The surface tension is different. The composition is different. The sound is also different because water has a sound too. It is musical. It hums. It has a sound. It has a rhythm. It has a rhythm around the earth with the moon and the tides. That is what I try to call attention to, that water is much more than H2O, and that water does not only underlie all life, but that it connects with it. Water carries and nurtures life continuously in us, too. We are also made up of water. We too, just like the animals, are only gradually moving from water to land. Each of us has started life swimming as an embryo in the womb, and only afterwards have come fully to earth, to dry land, as it were. We are getting drier in the course of our life. The water part of us is gradually reduced, but it is the water that gives us life, and life is not possible without water. So the earth has this incredible continuous metabolic process going on that we are, of course, interfering with when we are interfering with water. And this is a process that is connected with warmth, climate, seasons, sphere of life, with what is growing, what we take in as food, but also with our digesting of food, from the saliva that moistens it in the mouth to the gastric juices, to the digestion. Everything is carried by water and embedded in water. Water also mediates between heaven and earth in this rising up and coming down. It is in the plants, in the animals, and in humans. It is the bearer of life. I said this a few times, but if we are aware of that, the question as to how are we dealing with water today assumes another dimension. When we look at the earth, just one figure, if we go on as we are now, then in 2050, more plastic will swim in the oceans of our earth than there is life in it, than all life together. More plastic, which is not an organic material that will return to the sphere of life, but that will gradually and increasingly poison the sphere of life. This is why the question is so crucial. Can we learn to deal differently with water? I have invited a friend today, a friend from my youth. We got to know each other a long time ago. we did something together that he will also illustrate here, because at the time he took a door out of its hinges and he used the hose pipe to let water run over it, and then asked, "How do you think the water will run?" And I can't remember if it was me or someone else, but we'd all been through 12 years of school, and we said, well, of course it will follow gravity in a straight line from A to B. It will take the fastest route down. Herbert Dreiseitl will tell you what it's like really. He is an artist, and he is an artist in the way art should be today, in my view, because he is an artist who changes the world every day. He does that in Freiburg, Berlin, Überlingen, but also in Singapore, Los Angeles, San Francisco, or Beijing. He lectures at different universities worldwide, and in all these places he works with water and with people on the question, how can we deal differently with water in the future and with this planet? Herbert, I would like to hand over to you now.
Gerald
Häfner, thank you for inviting me. I am happy to be here and to speak about this very important topic. For water is the central element that is connected with the climate, and we all know how crucial the climate question is. I would like to divide my presentation into two parts. The first is to look at water generally, how we experience it in nature, and then at how human beings have used it, how it was introduced into cities, into the architecture industry, what challenges there are, and maybe then, after a short break, we'll also look at possible solutions. Where can we do something, and where are there possibilities to be in partnership with the water, which will bring us to the climate crisis and the climate question. But let's just start. The first thing that is important with the question of water, the human-made world has largely got rid of water. If we look at the industrialized world and at urbanization, we have learned how to displace the water. Canalization, drainage systems, the draining of regions to build industrial plants. I call this the gray infrastructure of our cities. We have drained the water away and so have no longer the building up of groundwater. We have little evaporation and therefore drastically changed the entire water balance. The big question is, how can we find a solution? I myself, and I started my work in Überlingen on Lake Constance in southern Germany, where I also started my work, a large lake that supplies drinking water for 4 million people. The water comes from the Alps, from melting glaciers in the summer, but that is no longer guaranteed. And then we will look at the mountains and at water is actually doing. Water is an element that does not only appear in the liquid state, as we have it here in these glasses. By the way, highly interesting how the water level always adjusts in this glass to the spherical form of the Earth. For the water mass in this glass and in this glass are in a relationship. They are both part of the Earth. And you also know in a state of weightlessness, water is perfectly spherical. We see this when the surface tension is very high in a dewdrop. So this water, when it starts moving, following gravity, is incredibly dynamic. It shapes our landscapes. It is the landscape architect par excellence that shapes and forms the surface of the Earth. through erosion, sedimentation, changes of deposits, and it is always in movement. And this mobile aspect of the water is a great chance for change. Water always holds a certain balance. It can balance out temperature differences, where water is lacking in the deserts, where the nights are extremely cold and the day extremely hot. So water balances out and is incredibly resilient in a way. Water also has the capacity to regenerate, to heal. Areas where the vegetation has almost been eliminated by flooding, this vegetation gradually returns, and it needs water, of course, for that. So water does all that and much, much more. It is part of metabolism, nutrition, elimination of waste material we have in our body that is transported by water. And there's always this incredible beauty and incredible aesthetic that we see in our landscapes and that also fascinates us. We tend to go on holiday to places where there is water. And if we look at water in detail, for instance, from an aeroplane or from high up, then we see these structures in all scales, very small, very big. On this picture, we cannot even say if this is a region of the Amazon, or is it a small part of a bigger system of water veins? The structures built by water are incredibly creative and rich, whatever their dimension. This is, by the way, in Australia, a quite untouched part of the earth that one hardly sees anymore in this form. So where water and vegetation meet, where we have erosion and processes of change, we often see the traces left over time. And our relationship with water is always a bit like a flash in the pan. We can only ever experience the brief moment. We do not see the process of change. And I think much that we can learn from the work of many people, as for instance at the Institute for Flow Sciences, Theodor Schwenk was a pioneer who worked with Steiner's ideas and said we have to think about water in a different way. And that is an important point with many questions today. If we want to find solutions, that our thinking has to become more fluid, that we have to enter into a process that brings periods of time and processes of change into a dimension that is more than our short-lived perception. I like to do this with my students, what Gerald Häfner just alluded to, by taking a door off its hinges. Nowadays I do it in a more sophisticated way. I use a plexiglass or a glass pane and let the water run across it. This is a very small experiment I show you on this film. So, a small experiment with a small trickle of water, and with my students, we try to observe which flow phenomena that are usually invisible can be detected in such a small trickle of running water. I give you the answer now. The water does, of course, not flow from A to B on the shortest route. It starts off like that, but then it begins to meander, to build up pulsating loops to the left and right, and is much more complex than we tend to think. So this vitality and dynamics of water is also something that is often lacking in our society, a flexibility and dynamic. For instance, also when entering into a relationship, water always enters into relationship with other elements, with the solid, liquid, gaseous, with hard and soft materials, and it is always the one that has the most staying power. It is very interesting, for instance, to observe how a river reforms itself. I can show this again in a small experiment here with my students in a master's degree class in Singapore at the International University there. Here, a few practical experiments in addition to all the theoretical knowledge one also has to have, of course, about flow dynamics and so on. We try to do this really hands-on with observation, where the students learn to observe precisely and where they also experience moments of amazement, for instance. They are amazed at how water flows back in certain inner loops that fishes, for instance, use so cleverly in order to swim up against the current of a river in the mountains. Much of the inner dynamic of water we know very little about. And I don't want to go into too much detail now because one would need much more time for this. Much study has gone into the inner structure, the inner forming power, the inner energy, and the information that water can subtly transmit. But if we look at the evolution of humanity, what part water has played in art too, then one can say we find the forms of water in all cultures. For instance, in the Langobardic braided patterns. I like doing this in workshops when I work with civic participation groups, that we first come into a fluidity, fluid thinking, I call it, in order to come to a more flexible idea of what water is and how one can maybe think water in the future. We are much too rigid and dry in our thinking often. When we look at interesting people, take Leonardo da Vinci, an inventor, an engineer who invented and discovered so many things, much that we are drawing on today still. But he was also an artist, a politician, and a person who exactly observed, but in a very lively way. He united three things: scientific precision. He observed exactly in the Renaissance period how can one experience things. He also began to see the philosophy behind all that in a kind of deepening. What does that have to do with our life? Maybe also bring some religion into it. We find a deep respect for water in all religions, and he always led this into an artistic process. This is something our children are able to do still. If you watch how small children play with water, how they absorb this element with great devotion, openness, and love, that is something I wish engineers had or planners who have forgotten it. We need to find this respect, this reverence for water again. I will show you one example here in the first part. I will show you some others later. But here we are high up in the Alps, where 2 years ago the first glacier disappeared, the Peisel Glacier. The event you see here on the 22nd of September was the funeral service for the glacier, the first glacier to disappear in the Alps. And we know that by the end of this century, 80% of our glaciers will have disappeared, all as a result of human activity. We have massive problems where people live in poverty. They are hit hardest by the way how we are dealing with water and what we miss doing in the world. Floods, lack of water, polluted water that children have to drink, where many, many people die, and we hardly speak about them. All these problems we have created ourselves. But also if we look at our cities, our civilized world, the Western world, Europe, America, Asia, We have all these problems that come back to us like boomerangs, especially as a result of the water question. We have, for instance, heavier rainfalls than ever before, where so much rain comes down in a short period of time in one small area that our drainage systems are unable to cope with them. And then we have flooding. And in the last 10 to 15 years, we have seen extreme rainfall in European cities many times, where it was too much for the canalization and ended in immense damage. Insurance damage in Copenhagen, for instance, where city administration and insurances said, never again, we cannot pay for this. And people then begin to think and find new systems. I will speak about those later. As early as 1980, I brought this first pilot project into the world with examples. Today, this is all mainstream. For instance, the Cloudburst project in Copenhagen or the ABC water guidelines in Singapore. I will show you that later. But with water, not only too much, but too little is also a problem. We experience increased dryness and too little precipitation. The European forests are dying because groundwater levels are going down. The trees can no longer grow their root system deep enough to attract the water. We have the worst droughts in a century, every 5 years now. We have seen tropical forests endangered, not only by slash and burn, but also due to dryness, giving up their capacity for evaporation, for cooling down the Earth's surface. These systems are immensely endangered, and globally, because the entire climate, the temperature balance system, that is not only caused by carbon dioxide, but above all by the surfaces that no longer enable evaporation and cooling down, because the aggregates change from liquid to gases is lost increasingly. The extreme dryness also has the effect that our towns and cities are getting more and more unhealthy. It's not only the pandemic, but what we find on our doorsteps, the conditions for our children and for ourselves in the periods of extreme heat we experience increasingly during the summer months now. We try to solve the problem technologically with artificial humidification, like here in America or in Asia. These questions and these extremes we will experience increasingly, and they will become ever more challenging for us. And the extremes are connected with the water question in all directions. For instance, a few years ago, I built up an office for a big company, a big network. I do a lot of research myself at Harvard University and also networking. We had the experience that the sea rose so high that it flooded the coast road because it had been so cold in January that the cars froze like blocks of ice, something never seen before. It was shocking. These pictures went around the world, and they show how diversely this water system reacts to the problems that we are creating on Earth. And the question is, of course, how can we, with the cities that we have built and with the way we deal with the environment, how can we bring something back of what nature has taught us? Can we bring our human-made world back again into a certain harmony with what the water really needs? How can we change our system that they allow for nature-based solutions? Nature-based solutions is a topic that appears increasingly around the world. That is a big question. Can we get away from the gray infrastructure that simply drains the water away as fast as possible? Can we slow down this process, retain, filter, store, clean the water? Integrated digestive and metabolizing processes slow down the draining off of water, build up groundwater again, create evaporation, create smaller cycles. All these are crucial questions. And these questions are always connected with how we are sharing. How can we achieve that our cities are no longer only monofunctional, but multifunctional? And that touches strongly on questions of usage, of sharing, and the question of social structure, the social order of our towns and cities. How do we deal with shared space, with circular economy, and how do we manage to integrate the water as a system in our human world? I will speak about this in the second part of my contribution. Thank you very much, Herbert. At the end of his first contribution, he will speak later more about that. Herbert asked clearly, how do we deal with these questions? And has made it clear that it is ultimately a social question. One could put it differently. Whenever I point a finger anywhere in the world and say, it's their fault, 3 fingers are pointing back at myself. And this we will talk about in the second part. What can we do? And what differs? And that differs. The levels also differ. Water? What forms do living processes need? Is what we chose as the title of this contribution. Forms can mean which natural forms does the water need? We have touched on that already. What architectural forms does water need? What do cities have to be like in the future? What does farming have to be like, landscape, so that a natural harmony can be achieved again? But it also refers to the thinking forms we need and the legal forms, because that is often underestimated. Legal forms, too, have serious consequences for the water. And this brings us to politics, to the public life, the domain where each of us is co-responsible, whether or not we are aware of this, co-responsible for how we are dealing with the situation on the whole. And I would like, just as Herbert will do it subsequently out of his work, relate a few aspects from my work. One example, in 1978-79, I was chairman of the Green Party in Munich. We had only just founded the party, and there was something that had bothered me even when I was still at school. We have this beautiful river in Munich, the river Isar, that comes from the Alps, which was in Munich at the time only a trickle. In the summer there was nothing left of it, almost a tiny trickle. And not far from it, the Isar Canal with lots and lots of water. The canal took most of the water away to be used to drive power stations and industrial plants. And we wanted to change this. We said, let's leave more water in the river and have less in the canal. We then found out that there were long-term contracts of 50 years duration in which this water had been pledged to private companies. These companies were owners, basically. A specific quantity of water was guaranteed to them, and the city, with all the citizens, only got that little trickle that was left because they had no contract. So we said we want to change this. I spoke and wrote a lot about this, but it was not printed. Hardly anybody got to hear it. So we thought, what can we do? And the first idea at the time was, we have to put it in a picture. We need to do something. We need to make this visible. And then we went and bought 120, 140 buckets. And I called all my friends, and we made a chain from the Isar Canal to the Isar River. simply taking water out of the canal, passing it on from one bucket to the next, a chain of people, and the last one then poured the water into the river. And the picture of this campaign, we called it Emergency Aid for the Dying River Isar, and that appeared on the cover of the biggest Munich newspaper then. And then this was discussed. And we really achieved that the water contracts made with the companies were cancelled and newly negotiated. And today the Isar River not only has a lot of water again, but we also have changed it, that it is no longer, as it has been for half a century or more, flows through a coffin-shaped bed, but that it flows in a bed where there are islands, gravel banks, where there is a bit of water here and there, so that the gravel is flooded and moved on. The river is finding its own bed as far as possible, and today one can even swim in the river again. This was a situation where a city won back its river. And there are many other examples that are associated with the question, what can we do as citizens? I will give you another example. In 1999, the state of Berlin sold its water supply for 1.69 billion euros. The majority to private power supply companies. And the contract specified that for 3 years the water costs had to be kept stable for the citizens of Berlin. And that was adhered to. After 3 years, however, it rose exorbitantly, and there was a rebellion in the city because more and more people struggled to pay their water bills. And there was an initiative that asked for the contract to be made public, but they were told that the contract was confidential. So people started a petition for a referendum that asked to make the contract public. That was the goal. And this was argued about for more than a year, but the citizens won in the end. And in 2011, the contract had to be made public. It then emerged that the contract was designed to guarantee an annual profit to the companies that had bought the water supply from the city of Berlin, and that the state of Berlin, in other words, the politicians representing the citizens, guaranteed to these companies that if they did not achieve that profit, that the missing amount would be given from the state coffers to guarantee the profit. And it had been specified that the profit always had to be 2% above the index for long-term federal bonds, and that meant that the state of Berlin had guaranteed to the investors 3.69 billion euros from the state coffers in addition to their privately generated profits. This made no sense whatsoever from the point of view of the people of Berlin. And what has been possible since then, that using the tools of initiatives and a referendum, is that the water contracts were reversed and the city of Berlin owns its own water again. In other words, the people of Berlin can decide democratically again about their water. This example shows an important question, because with many things, it is a question of us as citizens who are watching these developments. We sit there unable to have a say in the proceedings and keep being annoyed about how the water, the climate, the earth, the oceans, how they are being treated. We need to leave this audience perspective behind and have to become actors. agents. We all of us need to take responsibility for the water. And for this, we need the necessary tools. We need popular initiatives, petitions, and referendums. The tools of direct democracy, they need different forms of civic participation in order to be able to interfere. In Germany, we had 36 cases where the water was meant to be privatized, but where the people, the citizens, made sure that there was a vote on the question of privatizing the water. In all those 36 cases, the majority of citizens voted against privatizing the water, or even to reverse the privatization process and keep water as a commons, as common property. And that is an enormously important step, because it leads to us taking responsibility again for our present and future environment. Because we are the ones who are responsible. It depends on us and how we leave the earth to our children and grandchildren. For that we need these instruments. That means the forms that water needs, the forms that living processes need, includes these legal forms too. It also includes the question of property, because the idea to privatize water is absurd, just as absurd as declaring land to be private property. So even less can one make water private property. It's not like a bicycle, a guitar, a spade, something that I made and can sell on to others because I have produced it and I own it. But the water does not belong to us. It is there. We live with it and we live through water. And our task is an entirely different one. We are stewards of the water. We have co-responsibility for the water. And this is why I think it was a breakthrough for all of humanity that in 2009, for the first time, a woman received the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences, Elinor Ostrom, the first woman to gain this prize, and she won it by totally questioning a fixed idea, a fixed picture, an ideology of economics that for decades had been increasingly honed in stone. That was the ideology of economics, that the tragedy of commons. There was an agreement in the economic sciences that the commons, the joint responsibility for something, always ends in tragedy. If there is not one who has the responsibility and the profit, if it is not private property, then it will not work out. The idea was that if not one is responsible, then no one will feel responsible and it will all go down the drain. Elinor Ostrom did not theorize, but examined across the world on more than 400 examples. Is that actually true that it doesn't work? And she found out that with the commons, where people bear joint responsibility, the results and achievements are much better, more sustainable, particularly if it has to do with natural processes, the responsibility for natural spaces, and in particular when it is about water. Many of the examples she investigated have to do with water. She found out that where water is not privatized for profit, but where a wider community of people takes on the responsibility, discusses rules together, puts down these rules together, it is important that everyone is involved in this and also deal with it mindfully, make sure that the rules are being observed. In such places, people deal better with water, with fish, with plants, animals on earth. She really brought the idea of the commons back to life. And in the future, we have to overcome this wrong picture that emerged in the 19th century, that something can either be private property or it can be state property, and the state administrates it in a centralistic way, as it has happened in socialist countries, that we find appropriate forms of responsibility for life, the earth, water. Water is a public good, and at European level, in the years 2010, 2011, 2012, there was a European citizen initiative called Right to Water. They had the idea that water and basic sanitation are human rights. Water is a commons and not a commodity. That was the idea, and 1.9 million citizens signed this petition. The EU for a long time supported the privatization of water in almost all its member states, interestingly, particularly where there were most economic difficulties, Spain, Portugal, and Greece in particular. The EU sent the Troika there and said, you have to privatize the water. And Right to Water campaigned to change this policy, that water is a commons and that we citizens have joint responsibility for the water. So this is the fruit of an instrument we were able to create, to install shortly before, the tool of the European Citizens Initiative. That is not something that was just there, but something we thought out in the early noughties when a few people met in a guest house in Germany at my invitation, and we thought about what we could introduce at the European level so that the citizens have a chance to have a say in public affairs. So we developed 3 ideas. One was the ECI, the European Citizens Initiative, the right to take up initiatives. And between 2009 and 2014, I was able, as a member of the European Parliament, to contribute to making sure that this law exists today and that it can be used by citizens. And to my great joy and satisfaction, the first European Citizens Initiative, not only to be formed, but that also successfully went through this whole process, was this initiative called Right to Water. And this points to a worldwide task. As humanity, we must leave this audience perspective behind and realize that the future of the earth lies in our hands and that we are co-responsible for how things will develop on earth. We alone have this responsibility. We hold it in our hands. We pass it on to the next generations. But they will ask and look to us and the decisions we made. There's not much time left to do things better with regard to climate and water than we have done so far. Everyone can make a contribution to that. It begins with thinking in new forms, that we deal with each other differently, that we establish the legal forms, and that we make them reality on earth, in the cities and countries. Herbert Dreiseitl will say more about this now. I just want to add nothing good can happen if we don't do it. Herbert, please. So we will start the second part by asking what possibilities there are, what can we do, where can we start? Maybe a brief reference to your contribution, the question of rights and of society. 2 examples. The drinking water supply at Lake Constance that I mentioned earlier was not long ago privatized via what is known as cross-border leasing. That caused an enormous upheaval. Calculations were then made, and the American government in particular, which noticed how much is lost through this in taxes, and then the process was reversed and the water supply returned to the individual local councils, the population, to the communities, in other words, and this reversal was extremely expensive. But that was not talked about. It happens in many places that people wake up. Another example, 1/3 of public water wells in our town were recently shut down without much discussion in the town council. The plan to shut them down was made because the water supply companies are also private, and they worked out how much drinking water was being used in order to keep these wells going. And these are wells that were rooted in society. Many generations had used them in the past with much less capital. The population did not used to be in such a comfortable situation as we are today. In the past, these wells were valued and looked after. And wells are a symbol of living communities, and of course a symbol of a community's life forces. And we are now in the process of gaining back these wells again that had almost been lost. A lot is happening in society. People are waking up, realizing that water is a commons, that it cannot be traded and privatized. And this is something that needs to be realized across the world, a very important point. And now I want to show you examples of positive approaches and new beginnings in connection with water supply and water safety. For instance, the city of Singapore. Almost 6 million people live there. It is an island and therefore a limited space. And the situation in Singapore is that much more water is used than is actually available at present through the system. Singapore has 4 different water resources. One of them is the rainwater. For many decades, rainwater was quickly channeled off, in other words, lost forever into the sea. And around 12 years ago, we started, together with many other groups, but mostly with the city of Singapore, to think about a new system. And we said every drop of water that comes down in Singapore should be filtered, buffered, and then be collected, and then we have around 18 or 19 large lagoons. So we have divided up estuaries, turned them into freshwater lakes, and let this water back for water supply. This is called ABC Water Guidelines, Active, Beautiful, Clean. What is interesting is that not only technology plays a part in this scheme, but the participation of citizens. Because active means that we are in connection with the water. Beautiful, it has to do with aesthetics, which is a very important point, also in relation to moral consciousness. What can we not accept because it is too horrible and too ugly? So this awareness is growing, and that is a very important point that we have to include. And this is what the canals used to look like in Singapore. They were all drainage canals. Many of them still exist. And we managed to convince the city that through restructuring and complete recycling of the material, and through the integrating of these rivers into green areas and parkland, even on a smaller scale, that it is possible to deal quite differently with the water. Here's one example of several hundred pilot projects. This was one of the first. We freed, as it were, the lost river courses that were hidden in canals and tunnels that channeled the water off into the sea, and we cleaned it from waste products. It was part of a process of urban restructuring. And basically what Gerald Häfner talked about earlier when he mentioned the River Isar in Munich, this was applied here on a larger scale for the city of Singapore, where we are trying to open up the water, to show it, to filter it, to clean it. You see here the restructuring work stretching over several kilometers in the first pilot project. Of course, if you do something like this, people first shake their head. The engineers think it can't be done. Much needs to be considered, of course. There need to be hydraulic calculations, numeric computer simulations. One needs to know about the materials, include bioengineering techniques. But all these are new technologies and new ways that are possible and that constitute nature-based solutions. And today this river has become resilient. It carries water even in dry periods and when there are rainstorms, and that happens much more in these tropical countries near the equator than it does in Central Europe. And then the whole valley can get flooded and the water can be retained, cleaned and drained off. An integrated system. You see here from these two pictures how it has been integrated in the urban architecture. The one is a straight canal and the other is a recreated open river that fulfills the function of retaining, filtering, storing, and of delayed drainage, and of course that of evaporation too. But that also brings enormous wealth to the city. Of course, many problems with the water can be resolved through engineers and technologies, but it is also part of our experience of life, our experience not only as adults, but also as adolescents, children. What is their relationship with the water, with nature? Do they only know it from TV or other media, or can they experience it on their doorstep? That was important for us, and with this drainage canal that can flood in heavy rain, we built it in such a way that one can get to the water and that one also learns how to deal with the complexity of water systems. For instance, that one has to stay away if there are heavy storms because the water will rise. That's always a question. How do we deal with dangers? Water is always a dangerous topic too. And one can of course say, well, we fence everything in, so there is no danger. But what one really does in that case is one makes it even more dangerous because we no longer learn how to deal with dangers. Singapore is only one example. One could name many in Central Europe too, or in America. The problem, for instance, was that children often played in canals at night. There were fences on both sides, but because as a young boy one likes to go there, one plays football, for instance, if it then starts raining, they are cut off spaces. They are slippery and wet, and you can't get out anymore. Whereas nature-based structures are flat and one can easily get away. Before the restructuring, 3 to 4 children died every year because they could not escape from these artificial canals that were fenced in. But fences, as we know, are not necessarily a hindrance. So the question of safety and of how to deal with dangers means, in my view, from my experience, that we need to learn to deal with dangers, and that's what we need to educate the next generation for. Nature and life are always dangerous, and what is important in order to be safe is how do we learn to deal with dangers. Locking things away leads to the impression that everything is taken care of and that we are not responsible for our own actions. So a very interesting topic that I only hint at here in relation to water. The other points too, of course, how can one, if it is possible to get to the water, observe what happens in the water? Here, as in this example in Singapore, you see children, school classes, kindergartens, they all come to learn about nature. In the past, they could not do that. They would have thought, oh, a frog is dangerous, one mustn't touch it, soil is something awful and horrible. But here they learn to meet nature, to realize how interesting it is to observe dragonflies, for instance, when they are hatching, or to see how beautiful fish can be. And there is an amazing biodiversity now. We've also integrated cleansing biotopes there. They treat and filter the water so that it can be circulated, used in playgrounds, for instance. And of course, these spaces are now multifunctional and they can be used by everybody. And bringing water and green spaces together to create a healthy environment. During a pandemic in particular, green spaces in cities gain increasing importance.